Good afternoon, everybody. It's kind of strange for me to be here staring out at an empty classroom with no faces. But we find ourselves in this situation, and it is what it is, and I hope everybody's doing well, and hopefully this will give you a sense of some normalcy. Get to see me here in my natural habitat, and so I get to use my new toy here. So I decided this was the best way to do our lectures. I'm going to release the study guide questions one module at a time, and film the lectures that go along with those. And so the intent is that you can either read them in the textbook or that you can follow along by watching the lectures and get what you need. And so it's really whatever it is that helps you the best. There's a new emphasis on comprehension and being able to apply these topics now with the new format of the AP exam being just free response questions. So just to give you a preview of what we're looking at with Unit 8, Unit 8 is motivation. Motivation encompasses a lot of different topics, human motivation, specifically not just animal motivation, but human motivation that's based on things like physiology, your emotions, your chemicals, your drive, homeostasis, drive reduction theory, and even things like emotions, how emotional responses are, the various theories in emotion, whether or not emotion is a understanding of our environment, a cognitive creation, or is it something that just we feel as a physiological or hormonal feeling. So to run down the 8 different modules in Unit 8, and yes, there are 8 modules, but they're all short and they're very specific. And so the first one we're going to look at today is Module 37. That's what this lecture is going to focus on. The questions that go with Module 37. It's number 1 through 7 on the study guide. And that's the Motivational Concepts. It's really kind of an overview, but we're going to look very specifically at 2 topics that you need to know in depth and really well. And that is the Yerkes-Dodson theory of arousal. It's actually a law. And drive reduction theory. So we're going to look at those 2 things pretty in depth today. Tomorrow we'll get into hunger. Hunger motivation is a endocrine feedback loop. It's a biological loop from the brain's hypothalamus to the endocrine organs, and it kind of reciprocates. We'll get into sexual motivation, which is Module 39. That will be probably a little bit more informational than you care for it to be, but this is your chance to delve into these things in a scientific perspective and look at human sexuality and the human sexual response cycle from arousal, climax, plateau, refractory periods, and things like that. Then we'll get into Module 40, which is affiliation and achievement. That's like kind of social psychology, how we achieve when we're affiliated with other people, and how the presence of other people and the just motivation and desire to be affiliated with people per se. Unit 41 is theories of physiology of emotion. There's 3 conflicting and easy to confuse theories and theorists inside of that module, so that's what we'll spend the lecture time on in that module, is the difference between the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, the James Lange theory of emotion, and the Schachter-Singer 2-factor theory of emotion. So 3 different theories that we'll delve into there. Module 42 is expressing emotion. That's going to be things like your facial feedback and vocab words that go along with that, nonverbal cues, facial expressions, and things like that. Stress and illness is Module 43. Certainly something that applies now in this time that we find ourselves of anxiety and kind of tumultuous situations, of how people are more vulnerable to illness when they're in a stress situation and what that does to our immune system. And then finally, health and happiness, and that's positive psychology, people like Martin Seligman. And that's something that I think that it's kind of fluffy, but I think you'll find it like mindfulness, meditation, and things like that. You'll find that kind of beneficial and a little bit more lighthearted as a way to end the chapter. So let's jump into Module 37. Module 37 is basically built around the 2 ideas of the physiology of motivation and incentives. That's really what it is that what are the biological things that drive motivation, and what are the incentives that are not biology that drive motivation, right? So first, let's get into motivation and what it is. Motivation is really the reason for a behavior. It's the compulsion to do, right? It's the compellingness or something that's compelling to do, right? The need or desire that energizes and directs a behavior. And you kind of see some overlap in this chapter from previous theories and theorists. And you start out with Sigmund Freud in the early 1900s and his theories of what motivated human behavior behind the unconscious and internal conflicts and struggles, and psychoanalysis was designed as a tool to kind of unpack the unconscious mind. And then you had the neo-Freudians that came after him and said, well, no, people they are rigidly patterned, but there was more of a focus on personality traits with people like Carl Jung, and that's what became the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, and kind of away from the sexual conflicts, the things that were upsetting that the ego would protect you from. And then you get into behaviorism. And behaviorism from the 1920s to the 1960s is kind of an interesting take on motivation, because behaviorism started with Ivan Pavlov and the Russian scientist who basically coined the idea of classical conditioning, the idea that if you can take something that is rigidly patterned in someone, what we know is drive reduction theory now, so you take dogs, essentially they salivate when you put meat in front of them, especially when you put meat within reach of their mouths. That's just rigidly patterned into them. That's an instinct. But if you can pair that instinct with another stimulus that's completely unrelated to biology, essentially what he did with a metronome, a tone, if you pair the tone with the meat, then eventually the tone stimulates a response. So essentially, instead of salivating for meat, they salivate for the tone, which is a type of learning. And that kind of bred follow-up replications of people like John Watson with the Baby Albert experiment, and all of that was designed to show that most human behavior is learned, that it's motivated by past experiences and associations. And there's a carryover from classical conditioning and behaviorism to people like B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner was probably the most influential operant conditioning theorist. And the idea behind operant conditioning is that we as humans are the operator, and that our motivation for behaviors is actually a desired outcome, whether it's to avoid an undesirable outcome or whether it's to achieve a desirable outcome. And so behaviors that we participate in that are rewarded tend to be reinforced. We're more likely to go back and do those again. And behaviors that are punished are actually things that we're going to learn, and we're going to associate those outcomes, and we're not going to do those again, and we're going to be less motivated to do those again. And so you see a lot of overlap from 20th century psychological theory. And so this sort of encompasses that. We have the biological and physiological side of motivation, but we also have the emotional side of motivation. We have things like other emotional triggers, incentives, love, rage emotions, sexual desire, hunger, things like that. Those are also motivating factors for human behavior. So let's jump into motivation. In the book, Myers talks about, he gives this analogy of push-pull factors, which is usually what you see in immigration. It's kind of interesting connection for me when you see that there are things that drive people away from a scenario, or there are things that people compel towards a scenario. And so what he's using as a metaphor, the push factors are the things that drive our motivation. Those are the biological, innate, genetic things that push us to do. So we're going to talk about homeostasis in a couple of minutes, and we're going to talk about positive and negative emotions. And really the idea behind homeostasis, or drive reduction theory, really is that you have this set point that your body is used to existing in. That's the balanced internal state that is homeostasis. And when you get a positive emotion, it brings you above that set point. And so essentially you're compelled for action, and that's why it's considered a positive behavior. And if you're in a negative emotion like sadness, you're not compelled to do. You're below your normal set point. You would actually have to increase your hormones, or increase neurobiology, increase those neurotransmitters to get back to your set point. And so that's biology, right? Something that drives us from within. But there's also environmental stimuli. And that's what Myers calls these pull factors. Environmental stimuli are things like the desire for grades, or the desire for approval, or our willingness to do something because of an outcome, those operant conditioning things, right? Or even just like, for instance, something could be both a push and a pull factor, right? This idea that we have instinctively, genetically inside of us, this propensity for, let's say, anger, for rage, right? So you might naturally, genetically be predisposed to feel anger. But there also might be an environmental stimulus that pulls that anger out of you. So you couldn't have that if it wasn't a push factor. You couldn't have it if it wasn't in your genetic makeup. But what's driving it, or what's pulling it out of you, would be a stimuli in your environment. So those are the push-pull factors that Myers talks about. Our motivations arise from the interplay between nature, which he calls push, and the nurture, which he calls pull, from our personal experiences, our thoughts, and our culture, right? So for instance, what we eat the fact that we need to eat is drive-reducing behaviors, right? We need nourishment. The drive is hunger, and then the drive-reducing behavior is to eat. But what we find that tastes good, that's going to be based on culture. That's going to be a pull factor, right? So there's 4 different theories that we're going to explore today, some of them at more length than other ones, but here's the 4 different areas of that psychologists study in human behavior. We have instinct theory, and this is really just evolutionary psychology. That's all it is. We have drive reduction theory. We're going to spend a little bit more time on that because that's a little bit more significant that you understand. We also have arousal theory. Arousal theory is this idea that we can be emotionally triggered or aroused to do something that's beyond our own biological needs, whether it be curiosity or whether it be this driven by adrenaline or something like that, right? And then we have hierarchy of needs, and that's exactly what you think it is. It's Maslow. It's this humanistic idea that our behavior is actually driven the most by whatever internal need is the most pressing at that point in our life. So let's jump into instinct theory. Instinct theory is really just Darwin's natural selection used as an explanation for motivation, right? For behaviors when we say motivation. So what is an instinct? An instinct is something that is unlearned. It is rigidly patterned throughout a species, which means that it doesn't discriminate for culture. It doesn't, even in animals, right? You may not say animals have culture, but it doesn't discriminate for learning, and it doesn't discriminate for environment. So you have different species of bears, but they all exist in different environments. They exist in different ecosystems. They exist in different climate areas, but yet they still have the same instincts rigidly patterned inside of them, right? All bears hibernate. Not all bears eat fish. Not all bears live in even snowy climates, but they all hibernate. It is rigidly patterned, and it exists throughout the species. It is unlearned. That is the instinct. It's unlearned. It's something that did not have to be taught. Examples of instincts. The fact that birds imprint. We've seen this with this guy, Lawrence Kohlberg. And Lawrence Kohlberg basically, Konrad Lorenz. I'm confusing my 20th century psychologist. Konrad Lorenz was a Swedish guy who studied imprinting in ducks and certain birds that would imprint where they hatch from their eggs, and then some other species of animal is there to nurture them. Then they would imprint on them. There's like this oxytocin release in the brain that allows people to bond, and it's a very uniquely Bavarian thing to do. So that is an instinct. The return of salmon to their birthplace. A better example that's closer to home in our climate and our environment would be sea turtles. The fact that sea turtles instinctively come to the beach where they were hatched, and they lay their eggs, and then when those eggs hatch, they instinctively find their way to the ocean, to the Gulf of Mexico, and then they live their lives, and when it comes time for them to birth their own eggs, they come back to the place where they were born. It's instinctive. It's rigidly patterned. It's built into their genetic code. It's unlearned. It's not taught. An infant's rooting reflex. That's definitely something that is rigidly patterned, and it's not learned. It's something that that infants just possess. So instinct theory essentially is just natural selection, and there are some problems with it. It's not so much that Darwin was wrong or that evolutionary theory as an explanation for motivation is wrong. That what essentially was the downfall of using instinct theory to explain behavior was the idea that it went beyond explaining, and it just became identification. It was the idea that these evolutionary Darwinistic psychologists, evolutionary psychologists, started looking at human behaviors and just started kind of tagging them with labels. So for instance, little Tommy is crying. Little Tommy is sad. What is an instinct for Tommy to cry? Okay, well, that's true. It is biological, and it is genetically built into his DNA for him to be able to cry. But it also doesn't account for the stimuli that causes Tommy to be sad, the environmental stimuli, right? The emotional state that he's in, what's causing those things. And so evolutionary theory is not inherently flawed, but it's not great for explanation. It's kind of hindsight bias, and sometimes it even borders on just pure identification. In other words, there were so many different instincts that were being tagged as human instincts that it really went beyond explaining human behavior, it got to the point where we were just identifying human behaviors, and it didn't lead to explanations or motivations at all. And so that's the downside that you'll want to put as an answer for that question. Kind of inherently the end or the flaw in instinct theory was that it became more identification than it was explanation or identifying human behaviors. So to qualify as an instinct, a complex behavior must have a fixed pattern throughout the species, and it must be unlearned, like the bears that we talked about. It's throughout the species in multi-climates. It really doesn't discriminate for anything other than biology. Instinct theory states that motivation to survive is the most important motivation, and the innate behaviors that aid survival drive our motivations, and it sounds a lot like evolutionary theory, Darwinistic natural selection, obviously, that those traits that are likely to promote survival in an environment long enough to reproduce and create offspring, those will continue on, right? So, how do psychological needs create a drive? Now we get into drive reduction theory. This is where I really want you to kind of tune into this. Drive reduction theory is not extremely complicated, but oftentimes it can get confused because there are 3 different levels to this process. There's a biological need, there is the drive that comes from that need, and that drive leads to a drive reducing behavior. So we have the behavior, which is motivated by a drive, which is really nothing more than meeting a need, right? So there's a couple things that we want to look at here. You have to know the difference between a need and a drive, right? So we have the need, and we have the drive, and then we have the behavior itself. So you have to know the difference between those 3 things. Specifically, you need to know the difference between the need and the drive, right? So for instance, you don't need hunger to be alive. You don't have to be hungry. But the fact that you are hungry denotes that you have a biological need, and that need is that you need food, you need nourishment, right? So when you look at a need, that need is essentially something that's physiological. In order to survive in your environment, you need nourishment. You don't have to eat food to get nourishment. You can intravenously get nutrients put into your bloodstream. You can take the gel that they give for people that's packed full of nutrients. You can take concentrated food sources, pastes and things like that are packed full of nutrients. In other words, eating is not a biological need. It's a drive-reducing behavior. So this is a way to qualify behaviors versus needs. So the first thing that we have to look at here is that we have the biological need. And what they're going to do is they're going to give you some hypothetical scenario. They're going to say something like, Susie goes to the kitchen and makes a sandwich because she's hungry. And then the question that follows that scenario is going to say, in this example, what is the drive-reducing behavior? What would be eating the sandwich? If they say, what is the drive? It would be the hunger. And if they say, what is the need? It would be the nourishment for food. So the need in this case, right, would be nourishment. Let's see if we have... It's not even that you need food, really. You need the nutrients from the food, right? So the need is nourishment. That need, right, is going to compel. It's going to lead. That's where the drive comes in. The drive, right, in this case, the drive in this example, if this were a free response, would be hunger. And the drive-reducing behavior, right, would be to eat. Right? So that's definitely something that you need to know, the difference between a need, a drive, and a drive-reducing behavior. Right? And when we look at it, right, water creates an arousal-motivated state. Right? Food creates an arousal-motivated state. That's the drive. That's the motivated state. The drive is hunger or thirst. Okay? It pushes the behavior. The behavior is led, if you look at it in reverse, the behavior is driven by a need, right, to work backwards. It returns the body to homeostasis. That's the purpose of drive-reducing behavior. When you look at dopamine and dopamine reward pathways, dopamine is the motivating molecule. Well, why do we need a motivating molecule? Because we need, again, there's that physiological word, to keep a constant internal state, a homeostasis level of chemical balance, right? So, when we look at it, let's get rid of this here. All right, so when we look at it, Homeostasis. Homeostasis is an important concept for you to understand. We're going to get into the emotional side of homeostasis. We're going to get into the food and the water side of homeostasis. We have to look at certain things in order for this to work, right? So you have this constant chemical balance, this internal state, right? So let's say this, right? This is your balance level. Okay, this is the goal. Track with me on this, okay? This is where we get into positive and negative emotions. Essentially what happens is there's a constant feedback loop between the hypothalamus and the limbic system and the endocrine organs that are a part of your soft tissue, the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system really is what they are, right? So what happens is, just like the thermostat example, I like the thermostat example that's used as a metaphor in your book. The thermostat's job is to constantly check the temperature in the room. That is an ongoing process. It never stops. Well, that's what the feedback loop of your bloodstream is. So what happens is that the goal is balance. The goal is homeostasis. So that's how we remember what the hypothalamus does. Think H for hypothalamus, H for homeostasis. The hypothalamus's sole job is to determine how much of which chemicals to either increase or to decrease in your bloodstream. And how it goes about doing that is the endocrine organs. And you can see this is where the physiological side of behavior is. This is the motivation for certain behaviors. Essentially, we have to think something that rises above our normal state, and we have to think of something that goes below, and it's out of balance, right? So when we look back at this, let's get rid of that. Right? So when we look back at this, okay, if you have a positive emotion, right? So let's say positive is above, negative is below, right? So positive or negative doesn't mean good or bad. It means to increase or to decrease. So when we just look at the emotional side of homeostasis, this is kind of a better way to look at it, right? So when you have something like, let's say, anger, right? Anger is a good example of a positive emotion. And you might think, well, okay, you're still fixated on this idea. Well, anger's not positive. Anger's not good. It's not that it's good. It's positive because it is something that's it is a motivated aroused state. It is above your body's normal balanced state, that set point that the thermostat is looking for, right? So what's going to happen is, and when your brain realizes that you need to be compelled for physical action, that's sympathetic nervous arousal. Right? Sympathetic nervous arousal is going to bring you above your normal balanced level state. That's what fight or flight does. That's what the sympathetic nerves do. In order to bring you back down to balance, it's going to have to enact opposite chemicals. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. Those are those chemical hormones in the bloodstream that are secreted by glands that bring you back to your balance level. Because you can't have a positive emotional state for too long of a prolonged period of time because you'll expend all of your energy. But sometimes you get out of balance. You become angry. Angry to the point of rage. It's a positive emotion because it's above your normal level of arousal. And so that is a very motivated emotional state. So essentially, to come back down from anger, you're going to need something to bring you back to where that balanced state is, that level of calm, right? So you have an increased level of chemicals, an increased level of emotional response. You need to come back down to balance. This is the homeostasis process, and it happens internally 24 hours a day, every day. That's why your brain needs nutrients. That's why you need constant evaluation from the hypothalamus to the body. And when we get into the review of chapter 3, you look at things like the hypothalamus, which is actually, it's flawed and protected, both at the same time. It's a benefit and it's a detriment because it's protected by the blood-brain barrier, those endothelial cells, the astrocytic feet, right, which are part of those glial cells that exist in the white matter of the brain and protect that temporal artery that runs through your brain. It keeps things that are in your bloodstream from leaking into the synapses of the brain, but it also prevents things in the synapses of the brain from getting into the bloodstream. So there's a barrier between your bloodstream and your brain. So if the hypothalamus wants to bring you back down and maintain homeostasis, it's going to have to communicate with the body. That's what the feedback loop is. And how does it communicate with the body? Well, it's going to have to get a hormone into your bloodstream somehow. and that hormone is going to have to be secreted by something that's in the body. So the hypothalamus doesn't have access to the bloodstream, but the pituitary gland does. The pituitary gland is an extension of the hypothalamus, and so when the hypothalamus determines we're too angry and we need to come back down to our normal homeostasis set point, and so it's going to communicate that through the pituitary gland, which is going to create a hormone secreted into the bloodstream, and it will make its way to whatever organ is involved, and it's going to send a counteracting chemical reaction. It's going to bring you back down to your balanced homeostasis state. We have the same thing in negative emotions, right? So what if you're sad? Right? Sad. Being sad is a normal human emotion, but it's a negative emotion. It's negative because you are devoid of a certain chemical. That chemical has been depleted, right? So now you look at drive-reducing behaviors. Drive-reducing behaviors, kind of you look at where do drives come from. What if it's not anger? What if it's actually something like hunger? So if we take anger away, let's take anger away. All right. Let's delete anger from our lives. Be nice if that's all you had to do, right? Just erase anger. What if it's actually hunger? Is hunger an aroused state? Of course it is. So hunger is an aroused state. It's a positive emotion. It's not really an emotion, but it's a positive chemical physiological response because we've increased the level of hormones in the bloodstream. So now the hypothalamus has determined that you need nourishment. That's the need. And so it's going to create a drive, which is a chemical state, and that drive is going to compel you for action. And that's where dopamine and learning and rewards come in, right? That's where operant conditioning comes in, right? Sometimes you go to the kitchen and you get food and you eat it because you know it's going to taste delicious. It's a top-down process. Well, how does top-down processing work? With dopamine. It's that reward prediction error. When you know from experience that I'm going to grab this piece of pizza, I'm going to eat this slice of pizza, I know what it tastes like and it's going to taste delicious, well then you get a dopamine reward as a release in the brain's reward pathway. And the reason for that is learning, so that you will repeat the process again, right? That way you don't have to fumble around with how to cure your hunger drive every single time you become hungry. So hunger is a drive to meet a physiological need. It's a positive state above homeostasis so that you will be compelled to go do, which in this case would be to eat, which would bring you back down to a balanced level of hormones, and you don't feel that hunger response in your gut anymore. And so tomorrow when we get into the hunger response, we'll talk about that feedback loop and which chemicals from the gut affect the hypothalamus of the brain, and what does the hypothalamus of the brain release into the gut, which causes you to feel full. You have the lateral hypothalamus, which triggers a hunger response to bring you up from homeostasis, and you have the ventromedial hypothalamus, which determines that you have enough nourishment, and that's going to trigger a response that's going to bring you back down to a balanced homeostasis state. So you can do this with any emotion, right? You can do it with any emotion. Okay, I'm just blocking things out. Right? What if it's not hunger? Another example, right? Right? I didn't write the word arousal because arousal simply means that we are in an above homeostasis state. But what if your arousal is of sexual nature? Well, what is that? It's a positive increase in chemicals which creates a drive-reducing behavior. So sexual arousal is a drive. Then you participate in a sexual act, and after climax, you have a chemical response. You have a refractory period, and that's that period in between orgasm before a human can experience another one. We'll talk about that in a different module. And that's going to bring you back down to a balanced, calm state. So there's a lot of applications here. You can look at positive and negative emotions. You can look at hunger. You can look at thirst. You can look at arousal theory. There's a lot of things that you have to understand that come along with homeostasis. So this is a constant internal process. But there's pros and cons here. There's some things that you can look at as a person. Let's say you're experiencing anxiety. Well, what is anxiety but an aroused emotional state? So if we look at anxiety, right? Let's erase all of this. If we look at anxiety as an increase above our homeostasis balance level, well, then why would we need that? That really means that anxiety, if we look at it a certain way, is nothing more than a drive. Well, a drive is designed to push behavior. It's a motivating factor. So if anxiety is a push factor, if it is a physiological response to a stimuli, then think about how we handle our anxieties. We do it all the wrong way. We feel really anxious about something that's going on in our life, and we don't go and do. We don't participate in a drive-reducing behavior. No, what do? We ruminate on it. We take a physiological problem and we try to solve it with a cognitive solution. Well, that's pretty good. Let me say that again. We take a physiological problem and we try to solve it with a cognitive solution. So essentially what's happening here is that we have a biological increase in cortisol, the stress hormone, right? So what is, okay, I'm erasing when I should be right? So we feel anxious. Remember, stress is not the same thing as anxiety. Stress is cortisol. It can be bad, it can be good, it can be an increase. Let's say anxiety. So we feel anxious about something. Not an anxiety disorder, right? Because sometimes there's a healthy level of anxiety. If you're experiencing a certain level of anxiety about the uncertain future with this COVID-19 situation, that is not a dysfunctional response. It's actually a very founded and explainable response. So let's say you're feeling anxiety. Well, what is that? Let's look at it biologically. You are above your balanced homeostasis state in chemicals, which means that if you want to eliminate that drive, what do you have to do? You have to participate in a drive-reducing behavior. We'll get into that in another module. It's called catharsis, something that's cathartic. Freud called it sublimation. Sublimation is this thing, instead of taking displaced anger, like kicking the dog or doing something that's unhealthy and dysfunctional, we're going to do something that makes us feel sublime. We're going to sublimate our anger, right? Or we're going to sublimate our sexual arousal, is what he would say also. So we're going to use the term catharsis. We're going to do something cathartic. So if you're feeling anxious right now, know that you're in an aroused physiological state. Anxiety is a drive. So if you're ruminating on that, you're cognitively focusing on a physiological response. In reality, what you should be doing is you should be participating in, since you're an aroused drive, right? You need a drive-reducing behavior to eliminate that anxiety and get you back to your normal level of cortisol in your brain. So that's going to let you off the hook a little bit. It's perfectly natural that we feel anxiety, but you have to understand what anxiety is. Anxiety is a positive emotion. It's an aroused state. If we want to eliminate an aroused state, because what is our brain doing? It's compelling us for action. It's preparing us for action. Why do we feel rage? Why do we have sympathetic nervous arousal at all? We may need to fight. We may need to attack and flee, hunt our prey. We may be about to have sexual contact. That's fight or flight. We may need to flee because we're afraid and get away, right? But those are all levels of anxiety. Those are all types of a drive that's motivated by an increase in chemistry and the physiology of your body. So let me say that again. If you find yourself feeling particularly anxious, just know that that's a drive. That's an increased physiological state, which means that if you want that anxiety to subside, you have to participate in a drive-reducing behavior. And a lot of times we don't do that. We sit and we ruminate, cognitively trying to solve a physiological problem. We're in a sympathetic state of arousal, but we're doing nothing to burn that energy and to bring us back down to balance. So homeostasis is very interesting to me. It's a topic that can explain a lot of things, but it's essentially, I like this word, the regulation of any aspect of the chemistry of your normal internal constant state, right? Blood glucose, right? You get things like you get a sugar spike or you need less sugar. These are all things that your brain will do as a way to keep you at that constant internal state, all right? So let's get rid of this. Yes, all right. So, drive reduction theory, to sum it all up, right? The idea that physiological need creates a drive, and that drive motivates a behavior. And the purpose for the behavior is to satisfy a biological need. So again, you don't have to eat to survive. You need nourishment to survive. So, but how do we get that nourishment? That's a behavior. And again, that goes back to that reward prediction error. The example I gave months and months and months ago about the reward prediction error, it's an explanation of dopamine's role in drive reduction theory. So if you were a caveman sitting on a rock in the middle of a cave, you may remember me telling this example, then you need food, you need water, right? Those things are not going to fall into your lap. So your need for food, that's the biological need, creates a drive, which is hunger, but that hunger is going to have to be a motivated behavior. That's where dopamine comes in. Dopamine is the motivating molecule. It sends you out to go do. But it's also a reward molecule. So if you expect a certain level of reward, like you go out and you eat something, you go walk out of the cave and you find some berries and you grab them and you eat them, and they're disgusting and they make you throw up. Well, your brain needs to be able to remember that that's a dangerous food. And so it associates that food, here comes the learning, right? The dopamine lack of reward means that you're not likely to go and eat that food again. The operant conditioning theorists like Skinner would say that a negative consequence, in this case would be a punishment, is not going to reinforce that behavior. But from a physiological standpoint, it's dopamine that drives behavior, it's dopamine that rewards behavior, so that we're more likely to participate in behavior again if it had a positive outcome. And that's drive reduction theory. And that's explained by the motivating chemical that's in your brain, which is dopamine. So, how does drive reduction theory explain how we regulate body temperature? Here's a great example. Back to that thermostat that I mentioned before. This is a great metaphor. Our body regulates its temperature in a way similar to a thermostat. Both systems operate on feedback loops, right? And when we talk about feedback loops, what we're talking about is this. Go away. Go away. We're talking about from brain, right, to body. And it's a constant loop. So from psyche to soma, it's psychosomatic. So the brain, the body is going to create chemicals. That bloodstream is going to go through the hypothalamus of the brain. The brain is going to evaluate what is going on and what's needed to continue to get back to homeostasis. It's going to create a complementary or counteractive chemical as a message. That's how your brain communicates to your body. The hypothalamus, through the pituitary gland, tells the body's soft tissue, here's what we need to stop feeling hungry or to stop feeling thirsty. And then the body is going to respond by sending messages back to the brain, and that's the bloodstream. That's how the bloodstream communicates. So all of this, right, basically happens through the hypothalamus's evaluation of what's in our blood. And there's a reason why we have a barrier between the two. If there was not a barrier between that feedback loop of brain and body, then every single chemical that we ate or ingested or got into our system somehow, some way, some shape would affect the brain. And the hypothalamus doesn't need every single molecule that exists on the planet to evaluate homeostasis. It only needs a small select few. So those endothelial cells actually protect the blood. Let me say it this way. They protect the brain so that it only gets from the bloodstream those molecules that will fit through, right? And when we talked about psychoactive drugs are things that are either natural or synthetic that actually penetrate the blood-brain barrier into the brain, and the brain reads those as part of that feedback loop, right? That's how marijuana affects the brain. The brain reads that as dopamine, right? And that's how things like painkillers work, oxytocin, endorphins. So if you take something like Oxycontin, that's what I was trying to say, and which is ironically not anywhere close to oxytocin. So you take Oxycontin, or you take Percocet, or something like that. Well, what happens is that is such a synthetically pure molecule that it actually stimulates this feedback loop, and the brain assumes that that's a molecule that's supposed to be there. And so that's manipulating the feedback loop between brain and blood. But those of you in HOSA already know all of that. So that's how homeostasis is. To me, it's very, very interesting, homeostasis and drive reduction theory and how it creates behaviors. So how is behavior pulled by incentives? So we also have things that are not biology, or let's say physiology, right? So it might be biology that you are, let's say, romantically attracted to people. But it might be culture, what you think is attractive in a mate. That's a pull factor. That's an incentive. Right? A push factor is biology. That's drive reduction theory. The fact that you get sexually aroused is drive reducing behavior. But what triggers your sexual response cycle is actually a pull factor. It's actually an incentive. So a lot of human sexuality is environmental. And it actually could be nurtured. It could be behaviorism, right? Positive experiences early on in life could trigger certain sexual preferences or even romantic preferences of what we see. And that could reinforce thoughts and behaviors. So behavior is pulled by incentives, and that could be something that is biological or drive reducing, but it's environmentally stimulated, it's culturally stimulated, right? So not only are we pushed by our need to reduce physiological drives, we're pulled by incentives. And those are positive or negative stimuli that either lure or repel us away. And again, the example of the pizza. Your culture tells you what food is delicious, but your biology tells you that you need to eat food, right? So food, again, is the need. Let me say nourishment is the need. So that creates a drive, which is hunger. And hunger drives a behavior, which is a drive-reducing behavior, and that's to eat. Curiosity is a motive. This is an incentive that's not physiological. I mean, it could be because cortisol or stress in the brain could make you more curious, but look at things like a desired outcome that's solely based on curiosity. And this is probably something that you experience as a teenager. You're statistically more likely to be in this curious stage of your life. In fact, when you look at the big 5 personality traits, openness is one of them. How open to new experiences are you? Well, you're much more open to new things now out of sheer curiosity or need for excitement than you will be, say, 20 years from now. So curiosity is something that definitely motivates and drives behavior, but it might decrease as you get more set and rigid in your ways and you get older. So curiosity drives monkeys to monkey around trying to figure out how to unlock a hatch that actually opens nothing. And they know that from learning and dopamine lack of reward when they get it open, but they're bored and they're curious, right? So what other behaviors might curiosity explain? Curiosity drives newly mobile infants to investigate every accessible corner of the house. What do babies do when they crawl? They crawl everywhere. They go where they couldn't go. Cats do the same thing. It's a famous adage of curiosity killed the cat. Why are they going to? They just want to see what's out there. It's curiosity that drove humans away from the safety and known comfort of their own countries and homelands and sought out new lands, and they got on unforeseen oceans just for adventure and to see what was out there. It was sheer curiosity. And a lot of our inventions and problems have been solved by a curious intellectual approach. So this is definitely something that is not, it's not minor. It's very significant. How do humans seek optimal levels of arousal? Okay, here's where we're going to get into the Yerkes-Dodson theory. Really, it's a law, the Yerkes-Dodson Law. We're going to use the word arousal. It doesn't necessarily just mean sexual arousal. It means any kind of piqued interest. So when you pique someone's interest, that's an aroused state above homeostasis. All right, so you have my attention. I'm ready to delve into this idea. That's arousal. It's something above your calm state. So having all of our biological needs satisfied, we feel driven to experience stimulation. And this is not unique to humans. This is an instinctive drive. Stimulation is that also spans in certain species of animal, but it's something that's driven by, let's say, curiosity, but this need by arousal, right? So this need to feel heightened, above boredom, above apathy, we'll say. So lacking stimulation, we feel bored and we look for a way to increase our arousal. However, given too much stimulation or stress, we look for a way to decrease our arousal. That's the anxiety that we talked about, right? If you're anxious, you're going to look to burn off that positive increase of a certain chemical. If you're bored or apathetic, you may be looking to increase back to that normal level of attention or alertness, right? Let's talk about Yerkes and Dodson. Yerkes and Dodson is a significant, these are names that you need to know, right? So Yerkes and Dodson, this is a joint experiment that was done. It's actually been very founded. It's been replicated scientifically in various settings and since the time that they did it in the first half of the 20th century. And it's a kind of an interesting hypothesis. The idea is very simple, that human beings need an optimal level of stress in order to perform at their peak. It doesn't matter if it's a sports scenario or a musical instrument, it's speaking in front of people, writing an essay for English class, that there's an optimal level of arousal that you need to have in order to perform at your peak. So, but there's a caveat to this. If it's a new task that's difficult to do and requires a lot of conscious attention from you, then stress is not necessarily a good thing. So let's look at it this way. That basically the idea behind the Yerkes-Dodson Law is this. You notice on the y-axis we have a performance level, right? The performance level is going to be the dependent variable, right? The performance level should go up if our theory is correct. The x-axis is the level of arousal, right? So in other words, as our arousal increases, our performance should also increase to a point. So let's say, for instance, we have two different lines here. We have difficult tasks in blue, and we have easy tasks. So if a task is easy, it's something that you do well. Like some of you are very talented musicians, singers, songwriters. You can play an instrument. That's something that just blows my mind. I can't even wrap my brain around how people can play instruments because it's just not a language that I have. It's just not something I possess. So if we put you in a room and tell you to play the basic scales, that might be so easy for you that it's mundane, and you're not aroused enough to do it well. We have to create some stress for you because the task is easy. And then we get some overlap from the other chapter, which is social psychology. Well, maybe that stress level will come from social facilitation. We're going to put you in front of a room of people, and those people are going to create an audience for you, which is going to increase or peak your stress level. That's going to help you perform at a higher level. Or if you're like me and you're a procrastinator, writing a simple essay in English class is boring. Now, sorry English teachers, because writing is not boring. Expressing ourselves is not boring. It's just that we haven't invested emotionally in a topic. So what we have to do is we have to create an optimal level of arousal. Now, what we should do in defense of our English teachers is we should personalize the topic. Instead of a topic, maybe we should make it about a problem, right? Even if we're writing about, let's say, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay, for instance, we're trying to articulate what the problem is and state what we think our solution is. Then we would be engaged in the material. So it's not our English teacher's fault. We haven't found a way to engage the material. So what do? Well, we're procrastinators. So to create an optimal level of stress in our English assignment, we put it off until the night before it is due. And what that does is that actually takes something that we're low in arousal for, and it creates enough stress for us to make us focus on it and pay attention to it, and we actually produce a quality product. So those of you that are procrastinators and parents, you can earmuff this for a second, or maybe it'll help you understand your children a little bit more. The Yerkes-Dodson Law actually explains a psychological explanation for procrastination. So let me say that again. The psychological explanation for procrastination is this idea that we need an optimal level of stress to perform at our peak. If something is easy and mundane to us, we have to make it stressful in order to pay attention to it. Because here's the theory. The theory is that if we're not involved in it, if we're not stressed about it, if we're bored or apathetic, we're going to be very, very, very tuned out, and it's going to be poor quality work. If we're too stressed, we're not going to be able to perform. So there is a limit to this theory here, that as our arousal level increases, which would be the independent variable, then our performance level should increase, but to a point, right? So here's the point where that stops being true. When we get such a level of stress or arousal, we actually see a decrease or a drop, right? So what happens if we put off our English paper until the night before, and then we fall asleep, and we wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning? Well, now we're stressed out, and it's due in first period, and we have 2 hours to write it, and now all of a sudden we're trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation. Well, now we're so stressed, so aroused, that it actually has hindered our performance on the paper. So there is a limit to this. That's why it's a curve, right? As your arousal increases, your performance goes up, until we get to such a point that you're so aroused or so stressed that your performance actually suffers. Now, that's not the same thing for difficult tasks. If a task is difficult, we don't need stress to pay attention to it because we don't know how to do it. So if we're learning something for the first time, we're tuned into it. We're locked in. It's not a stress problem because we're paying attention to it. In fact, as we continue to increase our performance level, then basically what happens is our arousal decreases, right, as a response. So as our performance goes up. So for instance, let's say if you were to try to teach me how to play the guitar, it's going to be really hard for me at first. I'm going to be very stressed, very motivated and aroused to do it. So it's not a motivation problem, it's a stress problem. But as I start to master the skill, my stress level for playing the guitar is actually going to go down. So we have two curves here, and basically one denotes an easy task, that we need more stress to perform at a higher level, and then that stress will start to, or that performance will start to go down and decrease as the stress goes up. But the converse is also true. With new tasks, they're already stressful. We don't need more stress. We need more performance. As our performance goes up, actually our stress level goes down, right? And so those are two converse kind of peaking curves there. And this is the Yerkes-Dodson theory. And essentially it's explained thusly. optimal arousal. What is optimal arousal? It's between bored and anxious. I like this statement in the book. Between bored, low arousal, and anxious hyperarousal lies a flourishing life, right? So why are you not happy right now? Because you're too anxious. Or maybe a better example is you're stuck in your house and you're too bored. So somewhere between being bored and being hyper-aroused lies peace of mind, right? Mental well-being, right? So having all of our biological needs satisfied, we feel driven to experience stimulation. That's why we go watch horror movies, because we want to be scared. If we're actually in fear for our lives, we would not enjoy that. It's because we need an increase in stimulation in order that arousal actually drives kind of our curiosity. It's why we jump out of airplanes, but we don't want to fall out of airplanes. It's why we ride on roller coasters, but we don't want our car to be out of control. We watch movies about car chases and shootouts. We don't want to actually be in car chases or shootouts because we're bored and we're trying to increase cortisol, increase our anxiety. And this is the Yerkes-Dodson principle. So let's progress to the final part of this. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow, we know, we've seen Maslow before. That's Abraham Maslow right there, 1908 to 1970. Abraham Maslow theorized that human needs are hierarchical. Some have priority over others. Now, there's some interesting things to know about Maslow. Essentially, Maslow is known, that is a big line. He is a humanist. Okay, I'm not happy with that. Looks like a murder scene right there. Let's get rid of that. Yes. Okay. So, Maslow is a humanist. And if you remember humanism is about what human beings are capable of achieving. So Maslow definitely falls in that area, that category of the idea here is the optimal person, positive psychology, the opposite of abnormal psychology. What is the human capable of achieving? So the goal here in Maslow's studies is to find self-actualization. That's the goal. What makes a person fulfilled and high functioning in life? They self-actualize, right? But in order to self-actualize and reach their full potential, all of their needs have to be met. Physiological needs, and then increasingly psychological needs, and finally we land on self-actualization. So that's Abraham Maslow, right? So let's get rid of this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's actually been adjusted in the last probably 20 or 30 years to add self-transcendence at the top. Previously, this is where it ended, at self-actualization, because that's the goal. The goal of every functional human, right? In other words, if you work backwards, Maslow would say if you have an anxiety problem, a depression problem, or Freud would say that's an internal conflict that your ego can't make sense of, and it uses defense mechanisms, that's your problem, is an internal conflict. Maslow would say one of these needs is not being met. So if you haven't self-actualized, it's because one of these needs is not being met. But now, there's a new level. Maslow actually studied long enough to see that not only when people reach their full potential as a person, they actually transcend past themselves and they reach out and they help other people. So when you look at them in order, physiological needs come first, the need to satisfy hunger and thirst. Then comes safety, the need to feel that the world is organized and predictable, the need to feel safe. Now, what's interesting about Maslow is it's a sliding scale. So you may be fairly affluent, you may normally not want for much, and now you find yourself in a situation with, let's say, COVID-19, and you may have slipped back down into this safety scenario. So if you're in the safety scenario of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then essentially what's happening is this might be your primary concern. You might actually be concerned that you're not safe. And if that's the case, then you can't move past this to the next level. So your love life may be low, or your sense of belonging, or even your self-esteem, self-actualizing, that might be low on your list of concerns. And so this can change. Maslow's hierarchy of needs reflects what your most pressing need is at a given time. So in this given time, you might be in that safety area. You might need to feel that the world is organized and predictable, and that you can go back to school, and that prom's going to happen, and that graduation's going to happen, and all of these uncertain, unknown things. It's a great Maslow example. Your concern is not, do I belong? Your concern is, what's going to happen? right? So Maslow explains a lot of things. And this is the guy, this is one of those things that I mentioned to you that you can have as a feather in your cap, that whenever you need to write about something, especially in college, you can use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because this can be used to explain a plethora of problems. Whether it's socioeconomic problems, anxiety and depression, suicide, there are a lot of things that you can point at and say, one of these things was lacking or missing, and that's why this person, right, didn't self-actualize and become their full, complete self, right? You watch things like Tiger King, which I just had to bring up because I just finished it, and it's a train wreck, right? But it's a lesson in the hierarchy of needs. There's so many things that are problems with people in this, and we just look at that, and narcissistically we judge them. But essentially, if you take a Maslow case, we're somewhere in the needs front. We got self-esteem issues. People are trying to fit in. They want to feel loved. They want to belong, and so they jump into scenarios that they wouldn't normally jump into. They're trying to self-actualize and feel fulfilled and maximize their potential as a person. And then once they do that, they look out and realize that other people have needs. They can help. They can transcend, right? Why help the tigers? It's self-transcendence. It's not selfish, right? If it is selfish, if it is a sense of belonging, that if I feel more loved by my tiger cubs than I do by people, then Maslow would say, this is your most pressing need. So that's what I like about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is that really it can be applied to a lot of different things. And if you haven't finished Tiger King, that's going to give you a new perspective on it, right, after hearing this. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs begins at the base with physiological needs. They must first be satisfied before your higher level of safety, and then psychological needs. And so it becomes increasingly more psychological as we go up the chart. So we're going to land on that one. We're going to get out of here. And this is where we're going to find ourselves, right? We're going to find ourselves with self-transcendence and the importance of Maslow, okay? What's interesting, and I've mentioned Viktor Frankl several times, now is a great time in your life. If you've never picked up this book, and I've told you to read this book multiple times, now is a great time to read Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning is mentioned in our textbook. Viktor Frankl is the psychologist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. I'm not understating when I say it is a life-altering read, because it will change your perspective on how quickly your life can just go from having everything to nothing. So right now, you're probably in a fragile emotional state with a lot of things that have changed because of COVID-19, and now is a great time for you to pick up Man's Search for Meaning and read it, because it's going to give you a unique perspective. But when you look at it from a Maslow standpoint, near the end of his life, Maslow proposed that some people also reach a level of self-transcendence. At the self-transcendence level, people strive for meaning, purpose, and a communion in a way that is transpersonal or beyond the self. And he cites Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist. He was a really kind of a neo-Freudian. He was from Vienna, like Freud. Maslow's contemporary psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, a Nazi concentration camp survivor, concurred that the search for meaning is an important human motive. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. And that is a quote from Man's Search for Meaning. So that's kind of the end of Module 37, or really the significant things in Module 37. That's where we land of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So tomorrow we'll take a deeper look at hunger, and then we're going to progress past that into things like sexual motivation and some other things. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you're able to maintain some sense of normalcy and routine, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.